Okay, welcome back to part 2 of chapter 42 on circulation and gas exchange. So we ended part 1 by talking about the different type of circulatory system, different animals we will have, as well as going over some structures of the heart. And I mentioned how it is important that blood always go in this unidirection mode. You can only have blood going in one direction. And if blood was ever allowed to travel backwards into a previous section, that is what we call regurgitation. And if that happens within the heart itself, where blood is somehow leaking in from the ventricles into the atria, then this is where we call it a heart murmur, because we can actually hear that when we try to listen to someone else's heartbeat. Because before at the end of part 1, we're talking about listening to heart sounds. So that's why when you go in for your annual checkup at your clinic or for any doctor's appointment for that matter, one of the first things that the doctor do is listen to your heartbeat, and also listen to your lungs, because they want to hear whether there's any abnormality with the heart sounds, which can be detected easily with the stethoscope. And then they will listen to your bronchioles, air moving through your bronchi and everything, making sure there's no obstruction of any sort, because different sounds can indicate different diseases of the hearts and the lungs. All right. So make sure that you don't have, for example, a defective valve, because sometimes people can have damage to their valves. They sometimes can be born with it, or which can maybe fixed as they grow older. They say kids tend to have heart murmur more often, but they can outgrow it, but they just need to keep an eye on it. And then there's also kids that have went through a round of rheumatic fever. They were infected with it, and that bacteria can actually damage the valves in the hearts, and that can lead to heart murmur as well. So you got to be careful with kids having any type of rheumatic fever. Okay, so then with that, talk after finishing talking about the heart parts, now we can talk about the cardiac cycle. What is that? So and one cardiac cycle means it is the complete sequence of pumping the heart, which means that you are pumping blood out of the heart, whether it's going to the pulmonary circuit or the systemic circuit. And then you have relaxation of the heart, where the heart is then filled with blood coming in either from the inferior superior vena cava or coming in from the lungs. So that's what we mean by one cardiac cycle. So the contraction phase of the cardiac cycle is what we call systole, okay? Because this is related to your blood pressure. So that's what we have to talk about it. And so when we talk about blood pressure, why do you have an upper number versus a lower number? The upper number of blood pressure usually indicates the contraction phase of your heart. So contraction means systole, okay? And then the relaxation of the heart's phase is called then diastole, okay? So systole always goes over the diastole when we're thinking about the blood pressure. And that's why there's also usually a higher number associated with systole compared with diastole. And that's because of the fact that contraction results in a much higher pressure compared to relaxation. There's still some pressure in relaxation phase, because remember, this is talking about hydrostatic pressure. So there's still fluid moving into the heart that exert force on the heart. So that's why there's still some pressure. But when the heart squeezes and contracts on it, the blood, it will, give an even higher pressure. So that's why systolic pressure is higher than diastolic pressure. So the cardiac cycle is then just cycle of these diastole and systole phases of contraction of the atria and relaxation of the atria and ventricle, etc. So here are the 3 steps. Okay, they kind of simplified it into 3 steps. Okay, so in the first step, you have atrial and ventricular diastole, which means the atria and the ventricles are both in their relaxation mode. They're relaxed, which then allows blood coming in from the inferior and superior vena cava to flow into the atria. Okay, whether it be you're talking about right atria for inferior superior vena cava or the pulmonary vein coming in from the lungs into the left atria. Remember, both sides of the hearts are moving at the same time. So right now, blood is coming in from the pulmonary, from the systemic circuit, and also blood is coming in from the pulmonary circuits on the left and right and left side. Okay, and then they will flow into the ventricles just by passive filling a little bit. And then your atrial systole should happen first, where the atria will then squeeze and contract such that it pushes the rest of the blood that's remaining in the atria into the ventricles itself. Okay. Notice that the ventricles are still in diastole phase. They're not contracting yet, still relaxing, making it relax so that all that blood can come in from the atria. Because if this starts contracting, then we're in trouble because then your blood is still flowing in and you're contracting at the same time. So the blood will flow into the atria. Some of the blood will go this way. It's just a mess. So right now, atria always go through systolic phase first, contracts first, and then the ventricles are still in your relaxation or diastolic mode. Okay. Then the third step is where the ventricle now contracts, undergo ventricular systole, and then blood is pumped from the ventricles into the aorta, which is the red one right here, or the pulmonary trunk, the blue one, through the semilunar valves and going on to their pulmonary circuit and systemic circuits. Okay. So at this point, the atria is already in diastolic mode because usually after a muscle contract, they go right back to relaxation. So atria has already contracted here. It will then relax, already filling in the blood coming in from your two circuits. And then ventricles are now contracting to push blood at the same time to go on and refill blood in the pulmonary circuit or refill blood in the systemic circuit. Okay. So all of this are happening all at the same time. Okay, I'll show you a video that goes over this step by step. So don't worry, it may sound confusing at first, but you will see how it works, right? So when you have ventricular systole, atria are already in diastole, and you go back to step one all over again. So your heart goes through cycles of atria contracting, atria relaxing, ventricle contracting, ventricle relaxing throughout the whole entire cardiac cycle. All right, so heartbeat, contrary to skeletal muscles, because cardiac muscles, within your heart, there's actually cells that regulate when cardiac muscles beats. Because if you're thinking about skeletal muscles, we voluntarily tell our skeletal muscles to move. Move your leg, move your arm. You can voluntarily tell them to do that. And that's for a good purpose. We don't want our arms and legs just to be flinging around when we are not telling it to. But for the heart, we don't have time all day long to go, hey, heart, beat. Hey, heart, beat. If we have to think with our brain to keep telling our heart to beat, we don't have time to do anything else in this world. Okay. So the heart itself, which is really amazing, they have their own what's called autorhythmic cells, which are a group of cells that's located at a specific location of the heart that automatically sends out electrical signals to tell the cardiac muscles when to beat. These are known as your pacemaker cells, which is why people with a pacemaker, artificial pacemaker, are named after these cells. Why do people need pacemaker, artificial ones? Is because somehow their autorhythmic cells are not working correctly as they should. So an artificial pacemaker is placed inside their body so that it will send out artificial electrical signal whenever it sends that, oh, the heart is not pumping fast enough for this person. So they would artificially send out electrical signal to tell the heart to beat faster. But that's only for the case where their own pacemaker cells are not working properly. In a normal, healthy heart, autorhythmic cells, you don't have to mess with them. They will do their own thing all on their own for the rest of your life as long as you're alive. From the moment the heart is formed as a tiny little embryo to the day you die, these pacemaker cells will continuously do their thing. Keep sending out electrical signals to tell your heart when to beat. And that's why they send out that normal heart rate for you. Now, these are then, I said that they're located in specific areas. So there's two main areas where these pacemaker cells are located. First of those is called the sinoatrial node or the SA node, right there. Okay, this is a little GIF image that shows you the electrical signal passing from the starting at the SA node. And then it sends out electrical impulses to tell the cardiac muscles when to beat, as they know first pass those electrical signals throughout the entire atrium. Okay, note that even though it's just showing this side, doesn't mean the left atrium don't pump. Okay, there's electrical signals that goes around the entire atria like that and tells the atria to contract. Okay, there those cardiac muscles to contract, and then that electrical signals get relayed to the next group of pacemaker cells in the atrioventricular node, which is the AV node right here. Okay, so the SA node going to the AV node is a very important thing because if electrical signals are just stuck at SA area or the atria area, your ventricles will never know when to beat. Okay, so there are cases where people have a delayed ventricular systole, and that usually on the ECG or EKG, they can tell that delay, and that could be something going on with the relay of electrical signal from the SA node to the AV node. So that's why it's called the AV node, because it goes then towards the ventricles, atrioventricular area, to tell the entire ventricles when to contract. The other thing important about AV node is they will always delay about 0.1 second. You were like, oh, why that specific? Well, you have to wait till the atria has contract first, okay? Because we still talked about that in the cardiac cycle here. Atria have to contract and go through systole phase first. And then you have ventricle contract and go through systole. So this is why once the SA node tell the atria when to contract, that electrical signal is going to go very fast to the AV node, okay? And it may be faster than the time for all the blood to empty from the atria. So it's got to delay a little bit. Hold on a little bit, wait a little bit. Let's wait for all that blood to go from the atria into the ventricles, and then we will tell the ventricles to contract. Okay. So once blood has all entered into the ventricles, the AV node will then send out all that electrical signal to the rest of your cardiac muscles in the ventricles, telling the ventricles to contract. Okay. It goes down this interventricular septum and around the entire heart organ. Okay, the muscles on the heart is actually spiraling down like this so that it can allow for electrical signal to be relayed to the entire three-dimensional shape of the heart, not just, in a 2D plane. And that's when ventricles know when to contract. So SA node to AV node, telling the SA node tell the atria to contract, AV node tell the ventricles to contract, and there's got to be that delay. Now, we did say that usually these pacemaker cells sets your normal heart rate for you. Now, that's your normal average heart rate though when you're resting. What happens if you just decide to get up and go run a mile? Okay, so when you exert a lot of exercise, heavy exercise, your heart rate is got to go higher because it's got to meet the demands of your skeletal muscles needing more oxygen, and it is also producing more carbon dioxide as they're constantly doing this huge contractions while you're going for that run of a mile. So that's when then either the nervous system or the endocrine system will come into play. Okay, then they will come in and interfere with your average heart rate, because if you're running a mile, you cannot be in your average heart rate mode. Pacemakers won't quicken it for you. Okay, they are there to set that rate for you for the rest of your life. So what will then give signals to your heart to pump faster is then your nervous system or your endocrine system. In this case, I have just talked about the endocrine system here. I won't complicate it, because in AMP we talk about all the whole process: nervous control and your endocrine control and the auto control. So there's 3 controls to every organ in the organ systems we have in AMP. So just a quick mention right here that if you're in your fight or flight mode, you're nervous, you gotta run away, the hormone epinephrine is released by your adrenal glands in the endocrine system. and that will quicken your heart rate. Another way you can increase your heart rate is by increasing body temperature. So when it gets hot, they say that 1 degree Celsius increase in body temperature will increase heart rate by 10 beats per minute. That's quite a bit. Imagine if you know, normal temperature in a person, healthy person is usually 37 degrees Celsius. If you get to 39 degrees Celsius, that's 2 degrees only, but your heart beats faster by 20 beats per minute. So if your average heart rate is around 70 beats per minute, it was going to go up to 90, okay? Or from 80 to 100, etc. So this is why when we're sick with a fever, we feel like our hearts are pulsating and we feel hotter. And that's all because of the fact that the heat is caused, first of all, by the bacteria or viral infection. You know, our body temperature just don't go out of whack because we have homeostasis balance for that. So when our body temperature goes out of whack, something's wrong in the body. Probably a pathogen has gotten somewhere, or somewhere in your body is inflamed, undergoing inflammation. And so that increase in body temperature gets the heart pumping faster. Okay. And I think that's for a good purpose. When you're sick, you want more circulation around the body to get all those white blood cells to where they need to go, and then they will repair what they need to do. And then the debris from all their, fights and their battle against the pathogens, those debris need to be taken away too, again, by the circulatory system. So I think, by natural selection, again, adaptation, it's for a good purpose that our heart rate goes up when our body temperature goes up. Whether our body temperature is going up because we're sick, or our body temperature is going up because we're hot out there. Because then increase of circulation allows for, the fact that you can dissipate heat faster. Anyway, I won't go too much into that. So just a quick, little note about when we can interfere with our pacemaker cells, or interfere with our heart rates. Okay, so here's the quick video about how the cardiac cycle works step by step. Note that this video will show you both pulmonary circuit and systemic circuit showing in the heart at the same time, but they will explain one circuit in one section and the systemic circuit in another section. But they're showing two things happening at the same time, because in reality, that's really what's happening in your heart. It's not two separate things happening at two separate times. Pulmonary circuit and systemic circuit are happening at the same time. That's why your heart is a pump for two circuits. That's why it's called double circulation. All right.
This animation illustrates a single cardiac cycle, starting with the right side of the heart. In reality, of course, the two sides of the heart work together at the same time, but it is easier to understand if we look at them separately.
Also they will name the AV valve and the semilunar valves with their individual names. So know that you don't have to know that for your case.
Side of the heart has a different function. The cardiac cycle begins as deoxygenated blood flows from the body into the right atrium via the superior vena cava and inferior vena cava. In the next phase of the cycle, the right atrium contracts, pumping blood into the right ventricle through the tricuspid valve. Once the right ventricle fills with blood, the tricuspid valve closes to prevent blood flowing back into the atrium. The right ventricle contracts, forcing the pulmonary valve to open as blood is pumped into the pulmonary artery. Blood then travels to the lungs and the pulmonary valve closes. At the same time, the right atrium relaxes, ready to accept the next intake of blood. In the lungs, the blood picks up oxygen and releases carbon dioxide. Oxygenated blood flows from the lungs into the left atrium via the pulmonary veins. The left atrium contracts to pump blood into the left ventricle through the mitral valve,
or the AV valve.
Once the left ventricle has filled with blood, the mitral valve closes. Next, the left ventricle contracts, forcing the aortic valve to open, allowing blood to be pumped into the aorta and from there around the body. The aortic valve closes to prevent blood flowing back into the left ventricle, and the left ventricle relaxes, ready to accept the next intake of blood. Cardiac cycle is now complete.
So in a sense, this is the third time we have went over pulmonary circuit and systemic circuit and what happens within the heart. Know that I actually teach this. I teach this when I was teaching a non-majors biology class. I also go over this. And if they can understand it, you can understand it. It's not too tough. Um, but once you get it, you're like, oh my goodness, this is what the heart does for me. And you should be like, wow, that's so cool. Hopefully that's the feeling you get about the heart, because the heart is one of my favorite organs to talk about the human body. All right, so then we got the heart done talking about the heart. Now the second component of a circulatory system, remember, is then the blood vessels. So blood vessels, again, will breeze through this section because the heart is the probably the more complex part, and talking about how the different organization between animals differ. Blood vessels, we're just gonna breeze through some of the major parts about it. So, vertebrate circulatory system always relies on blood vessels to deliver oxygen and nutrients with the fluid in there called blood, and they will remove waste throughout the body. So, there are three main types of blood vessels for vertebrate system. First, you have arteries. Arteries always carry blood away from the heart towards body tissues. Okay, so I always tell my students artery starts with an A. A for away from the heart. Okay, because there's this misconception out there where they think arteries on, for example, pictures and models, they tend to be red. So they think, oh, arteries are red with oxygenated blood or oxygen rich blood. That is false. Okay. Or the fact that they're named arteries versus vein is not because of their oxygen content. It is because of the direction that they're flowing. Are they flowing from, excuse me, towards the heart, or are they flowing away from the heart? And arteries always have blood flowing away from the hearts, okay, which is why there are cases on pictures and models where pulmonary, or excuse me, veins are actually labeled red, arteries are actually colored blue. I won't talk about those here, but that there are cases when that's the case because of the fact that arteries means that they're moving away from the heart towards the body tissues. So for arteries, some characteristics that differ it from distinct, make it stand out from the other two types of blood vessels. Arteries are the thickest wall of them of the three because they have to be strong and elastic to withstand that high pressure coming in. Okay, so let me do a quick drawing of these. Let me see if I remember how to do this. I think it's that. Yes. Okay. So the heart is there. Okay, so the heart is in the center. It has to pump out blood towards the arteries. Okay, and from the arteries, it goes to capillaries. Okay, and from capillaries, it goes back to the heart. Okay, so this is capillaries. Okay, and this is then your veins. All right, so this is why arteries is have to withstand all that pressure coming out from the left ventricle. Okay, remember, it's the left ventricle. Okay, we divide the heart into four chambers. It is the left ventricle that is pushing blood up this way. Okay, so the moment this ventricle is pushing or contracting, you're talking about just around 120 millimeters of mercury. That's how that's the units of measurement for pressure of fluids. So 120 millimeters of mercury of force that's coming out of the heart into the aorta first, of course, and then into the arteries. Okay, by the time it gets to the capillaries, it's about 35. It has already decreased to 35 just because of how that long distance we're traveling throughout the body. And don't worry, these are numbers you guys don't have to know. My anatomy students have to know. And then by the end of the capillaries, they have 18 millicuries. This is a very low pressure. Okay, so veins are only seeing about 18 millimeters mercury, or in short, we call it millicurie. 18 millicuries of pressure, whereas arteries are seeing first 120 millicuries of pressure. We're talking about a difference of 100 units of pressure here. So this is why arteries have to be able to withstand that high pressure coming out of the heart. Remember, just like the heart muscles, Aorta, that is the only aorta you have for the rest of your life. Aorta don't just grow a new one when it's damaged. They may try to recover some, try to, fix some repair if it's torn somehow, but it might not be completely fixed. These are things that can't just grow back when they're damaged. So this is why this, I like to call it kind of like a water hose. This water hose has got to last you years and years and years as long as you're alive. And it's constantly bombarded with this high pressure. And that's what's amazing about these arteries. I mean, if you imagine pipes out there, like metal pipes on the streets, they have to switch out those pipes every couple tens, 20s of years, okay? But these are pipes that is living inside our bodies that can live for 50, 60, 70, 80, 100 years even, for as long as you're alive. That's what's amazing about the human body, okay? All right, so let me exit out of this. So, that's why arteries have to be thick-walled. They have to be strong and elastic because when blood is pushed in with such a great force coming out of the heart, that you know section of blood, that part of blood will then gush into the aorta. Okay, when it gets into the aorta, it expands the aorta temporarily because of the high pressure, and then in order for the aorta to keep the blood flowing, it will then do what's called an elastic recoil. Okay, so here's aorta. Blood is now gushing into the aorta. Now the aorta kind of bulges out like that because of that high pressure of blood flowing in everywhere in that area. In order to keep that blood moving onwards, it will then do a elastic recoil to recoil that tube back and push that blood onto the arteries, arterioles, etc. Okay, so this is why arteries have to be elastic as well because they gotta withstand that big pressure and they also gotta relay that pressure towards the rest of your system in order to keep the blood moving. Okay, because the heart is the only pump we got. Once it gets into the arteries, then it's all on its own. So arteries have these elasticity to give it that little recoiling function and allow blood to keep going upwards, onwards. Okay. All right, so that's why arteries are usually have three layers. You have the outer layer that's filled with collagen. Remember collagen we talked about? What is that for? It is for structural support, right? And in this case, it gives it some flexibility as well, other than structural support. It gives arteries some flexibility so they can recoil during blood flow. Then the middle layer, so this is arteries right here. That's the outer layer I was talking about with collagen. And here's that middle layer, which is then filled with smooth muscles. Again, also with elastic fibers. This is even more stretchy compared to collagen fibers that allows for that elastic recoil I was talking about. And then the most inner layer is called the endothelium, which is that tiny little layer right there. Just a single layer of flattened epithelial cells to give the tube some sort of shape and allow for things to diffuse out of it. And so coming out of the heart, you get to the aorta. Aorta then go to arteries. From arteries, they will branch into tinier blood vessels, not as tiny as capillaries yet, but as smaller arteries called arterioles. And then they will branch into capillaries. Capillaries are usually forming in networks. Okay, they're not just one single tube like the artery or the vein. They form what's called capillary bed, just like that. And then these bed will kind of infiltrate. I don't like the word infiltrate, but the book uses that. I like to call it like a big fishing net wrapping around the organ. And of course, it also goes into the tissue. That's why they use infiltrates. But other than blood vessels going into a three-dimensional lump of tissue, an organ, there's this big net that wraps around the entire organ as well. That's what's called capillary bed. And capillaries are usually microscopic vessels, very tiny. We cannot see it with our naked eyes. They are as thin as one strand of hair. And because they are for the purpose of exchange. Arteries and arterioles is not for gas exchange. Capillaries is for gas exchange, exchange of nutrients, and also waste materials. Things can't just come out of the arteries or the veins, okay? Capillaries is the one that does that. So that's why capillaries have very thin, also porous walls. There's a lot of holes in them. There's different types of capillaries too, depending on what is going on in that organ, but there's holes regardless. And those holes are then for the diffusion of gases and chemicals that goes between the blood and also the interstitial fluid that surrounds your tissues or your cells and organs. So pretty much it's just an endothelium layer like this that is surrounded by some sort of extracellular layer called the basal lamina. I didn't put that in there as a bold underlying word because you don't have to know that for your case. I know it's a lot of terms already, lots of stuff to know for this chapter. So I'm not making you remember the names of all of these layers. In A&P, we have names for all of these layers. I mean, like I said, this is just a glimpse into what the cardiovascular system looks like. Now, the other cool thing that capillaries have is something called precapillary sphincters. So I've mentioned before that, you can regulate where blood goes, okay, in your body. Some blood can go in the liver, some blood can go in the stomach at a given point in time throughout your day. And that's because we don't have blood to be where every single part of your body are filled with blood. So your body goes through this really complex mechanism of knowing where in the body you need blood for at the moment. So these precapillary sphincters is then for closing off a capillary bed so that blood will not waste our time and flowing through all the capillary bed tissues like this when is not necessary. Okay. So that's how you can control blood flow to specific tissues and organs by these precapillary sphincters that does their job of closing off that capillary bed when that organ is not necessary. So one example of that is, let's say you just ate a big meal. So now where the blood needs to go? The blood needs to go to your stomach and intestine. So a lot of your capillary beds that surround your stomach, your intestine now would be filled with blood. And then things like, blood going towards other parts of your body, it is not really diverting in that area because what's important right now is not running away, okay, or going for a mile run. You don't want to do that. After a meal, you want what you want to do. You want to sit down on the couch and just lay down, and eventually you feel like you're sleepy and want to fall asleep, right? So that's what that is result of. It's because blood is being diverted away from elsewhere to your digestive system, digesting your food for you, absorbing nutrients for you, as we've talked about in the last chapter. So that's one example. All right, and then the third type of blood vessels are called veins, which they are for the purpose of carrying blood back to the heart from the body tissues towards the heart. Okay, so these like I've drawn earlier, they're not there to withstand high pressure. Okay, they're just taking blood back to the heart like a tube. So, and the pressure by the time you get to the veins is 100 units less than when it was coming out of the heart. So thin walls is good enough. We don't need thick walls for it. And their smooth muscle layer is also a lot thinner because you don't need to do any, elastic recoil at this point because there's not much pressure coming through the veins. So it's very low pressure as blood flows through the veins. So it poses a problem for blood flow from the bottom of your feet, for example, all the way up back up to your heart because blood got to go back to the heart, even from your little toes. So what allows for blood to come back up to the heart at such low pressure and fight against the gravity pull is that's why veins have two things to assist with blood flow. They have something called valves, and they have something to do with muscular contractions, skeletal muscle contraction. So I'll talk about those in a bit when I talk about blood flow, but know that veins are the only type of blood vessels that has valves in it out of the three, okay? And skeletal muscle contraction also assists with blood flow back to the heart. It's kind of like what I talked about with the open circulatory system that, those animals will use their body movements for helping, assisting with circulation. Something similar like that here in this case. So from capillary beds, it will converge first into what's called venules, and from venules, then it will, sort of converge into bigger vessels called the veins, eventually converging into your big vein blood vessel called the vena cava, where the superior, inferior, and then back to your heart. Okay, so again, the circuit goes like this: from the heart goes out the aorta, from the aorta goes branch out into arteries Arteries branch out into arterioles, which are smaller, and then from arterioles they will reach your capillary beds, which are the tiniest, and covers entire organs where gas exchange happens. From capillary beds, they converge back to venules. Venules, you don't have any gas exchange happening. It's just taking blood back to the heart. Venules then converge to veins. Veins then goes to your large superior inferior vena cava and then brings blood back to the heart. Okay, then that's all about blood vessels that I'm going to go over. Okay, and then you have blood pressure. Okay, because I talked about how your heart is generating all these different pressure in systolic mode versus diastolic mode. So that's why we can measure blood pressure in our blood vessels, because there's no way to wrap something around your chest or something and feel the pressure, in your heart. You can't do that. But we can indirectly measure our heart's pressures by the pressure that's being exerted in our blood vessel. And this is why we usually put the cuff on our left arm and right about the level of our hearts. We don't do it on our forearm or our elbow. We kind of do it on our upper arm area, and that's because that's about the same level as the heart. And we know that's, sort of kind of close to the heart, where it would indirectly measure the diastolic pressure and systolic pressure of the heart. Okay. So systolic pressure, as I've said before, measures the systolic means contraction. So this is when ventricles contract. What is the highest arterial blood pressure coming out of your heart? And then diastolic pressure is measuring when ventricles relax. What is the lower arterial blood pressure then? Remember, this blood pressure is just measuring pressure of fluid going through your artery, not your heart, but it is indirectly measuring your heart's pressure in that sense. All right, so blood pressure measurements, you usually get two numbers, a higher number and a lower number. The upper numbers called systolic pressure, which is higher because the ventricles are contracting. The lower number is called the diastolic pressure, which is when the ventricles are relaxing. Now, gravity can have a significant effect on blood pressure, which is why when they tell you, when you go to a clinical office, they take your blood pressure, the medical assistant help you, or the nurse help you take blood pressure, is they tell, oh, put your arm on the table and don't cross your legs, okay? They don't say, drop your arms to the side and let me measure it. No, hardly they don't do that. That's because, when you change the position of your arm, it can slightly affect your blood pressure or blood pressure measurement, because how much your blood pressure is fighting against gravity differs at different height levels. So um, this also goes with why when our brains don't have enough blood, because there are certain areas, certain cells within your brain, receptor cells, that senses blood pressure. Okay. So when it knows that, oh, there's not enough blood pressure coming into the brain, we're in trouble, because just like the heart cells, when blood is not going enough to your brain, those neurons, which are cells of the brain, will start dying, just like cardiac muscle cell. And in this case, it's even, not even more, but it's just as important as your cardiac muscles. If neurons starts dying, again, they don't come back. Neurons cannot do mitosis or cell divisions like our skin cells do. So once they die, they will never come back. This is why your brain have that particular part of the those cells that would sense the blood pressure, because they know what a detrimental consequence it will be when there's not enough blood supply to the brain. They know those neurons will start dying and you will start losing cognitive abilities and you may even die. So this is why when the brain senses that blood pressure is too low in the brain, it triggers your fainting as a response. Okay, because when you faint, you usually fall to the ground, right? Of course, that's not good for your bones and your bruises, etc., and maybe injuries from the fall. But your brain is like, it's better you drop down on the ground, get that brain at the same level as your heart, so that you can get blood flowing back to the brain. Okay. which is also why sometimes after a person faints, laying down for a little bit, they will wake up eventually. And that's because of the fact that, oh, there's now enough blood circulating into the brain, and now you're awake. Okay, telling you, okay, it's okay now. But probably you got to deal with why your blood pressure was low in the brain to begin with. Okay, but this is why your body triggers, or your brain, in a sense, triggers fainting, is to quickly bring your head to the same level as your heart, so their head is not constant. You don't have to fight against gravity, and allow that blood to flow into the brain easier. Now, this goes then along with our talk about animals, other animals. So, giraffe actually have very long necks. So, they have to fight against a lot of gravity, gravitational pull, as that blood travels all the way up their necks to their head for their brain. So, their hearts actually require a systolic pressure higher than 250 millicuries units of pressure in order for that blood to reach its head. Okay, again, that's due to gravitational pull. That's why they need more pressure. So when their head lowers, which is you kind of see them doing it slowly. If they have to dip down their head into the water, they do it slowly. But one thing they got to do and be able to do is quickly lower their blood pressure, so that when their head is all the way down close to the ground, they don't need that high 250 units of pressure anymore. Because if that pressure stays high, that can actually cause damage, because they will go into temporary hypertension mode, too high blood pressure. So when their head dips down, there's certain homeostatic mechanism that will immediately lower their blood pressure, so that their brain blood vessels don't get damaged, or any blood vessels going to the brain does not get damaged. All right. So, along with gravitational pull, as I've said earlier, veins, because of the low pressure of fluid that's inside veins, there are valves, both two things, valves and skeletal muscle contraction that helps with blood flowing back into the heart from the veins. Because if you're talking about vein, all the way down at your feet, this is representing your legs right here. Blood has got to go up your leg against the pull of gravity. So here are the valves. You see this little flap right here, this little flap right there. So when blood goes up a section, it will try to come back down, but it can't go all the way back down because it closes the valve when the blood tries to come back down. So it stops there. And then when another systolic pressure comes in, or a little more bit more pressure comes in, it gets pushed up a section and then falls back down to the next valve, push up a section, falls back down to the next valve, etc., until that blood is all the way back up to the heart. So, in addition, when your skeletal muscles, such as your calf muscles, are squeezing on the blood on the vein like that, it also helps with squeezing, like a little exterior pump, if you think about it. An exterior pump that pushes on the vein allow blood to move to the next section. So that's why valves and skeletal muscle contraction both contribute to blood flow back to the heart, and which is actually before that. And this is why when they say, oh, when you go on the plane for a long plane ride, even though you can't move around or stand around or run around, you should at least, kind of wiggle your legs a little bit, move your thighs up and down a little bit, get those calf muscles working a little bit, because if you're just staying stagnant throughout that 9-hour flight, for example, that blood have more chances of pooling around your legs. And if you already have some sort of, pre-problems, pre-medical problems with blood clotting, arteriosclerosis, plaque formation, etc., that can actually offset a blood clot. Okay, so or starts a blood clot in that area, because when blood pools, they have higher chance of clotting. And when a blood starts clotting, let's say now after the 9-hour flight, you have this huge clot in your leg and in your thigh that's been just lodged in there throughout that whole 9-hour flight. And now you get up all of a sudden and now start walking, circulation starts happening again. That huge blood clot can start dislodge from the area where it was formed. And then it can goes up to your brain for a stroke. It can go on to your heart for a heart attack, or it can go on to your pulmonary arteries and pulmonary vein for pulmonary embolism, okay, which all of the above will give death very quickly. So This is why, you have to, regardless you're healthy or unhealthy, have pre-problems with cardiac problems or things like that, still wiggle your leg around when you're on the plane because of the fact that, skeletal muscle contraction helps with blood return back to the heart so they don't end up pooling in an area of the body. So this is another scary situation. So in rare cases, notice it as rare, some runners and athletes can suffer heart failure if vigorous exercise was stopped abruptly. Why that's the case? So when you're talking about a professional athlete, okay, during really hard, excessive, really strong exercises, okay, so the leg muscles, let's say it's just, stop, constantly contracting, relaxing, contracting, relaxing, going through that cycle. So if those leg muscles all of a sudden stop, okay, you just stand there and do nothing, fall to the ground and do nothing, now, all that nice skeletal muscle for helping the heart return, the blood return back to the heart is gone. So now you have less blood going back to the heart. And on top of that, your heart is still beating very fast. Okay. Because our heart is not like turn on and turn off in a snap like that. Our heart slowly climbs up to a certain point and it got to slowly come back down when we're resting. So that's why when you just abruptly stop working out, your heart just continue bum 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 bum. They will continue to pound like crazy because it's been pounding at its maximum rate while you're doing those exercise. But yet there's less blood going to the heart. And in a severe rare situation, now there's not enough blood going back to the heart, and your heart is still exerting all that energy, using up the oxygen in there. Once is not having enough oxygen, and if your heart was weak or damaged to begin with, the heart may malfunction and completely stop. Okay, and that can lead to a cardiac arrest or heart failure. In this case, the heart can completely stop pumping because in that moment they don't have enough oxygen to survive. Okay, those cardiac muscles starts dying, and if enough of that starts dying, your heart completely stops. So this is why after rigorous activity, it is always advised to do some moderate activity to cool down your workout so that you don't go abruptly from really hard exercise, working out your cardiovascular system, and then stopping abruptly. Okay. And then your cardiovascular system is still bum, 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 like that. Okay. It takes time for their heart to cool down. So that's when after a hard run, you will still, maybe walk a little bit. Okay. Walk a little faster, faster. And then you will slowly slow down your pace until you get to normal walking average speed, and then you can stop your workout. You can even feel your palpitation of the heart is not as strong anymore when you're doing cool down exercise. So never go from really rigorous exercise to a complete abrupt stop. Unless this is, I don't know, emergency situation. Who knows what that can be, but usually do some moderate activity to cool down your body. All right, and then you have blood components. Blood components is, within the fluid of the thing, that blood that is circulating around your body, what's in there, okay? Now remember, hemolymph that is transported by open circulatory system always have the same composition as your interstitial fluid, while blood in your closed circulatory system are more specialized compared to interstitial fluid. There's these particular components of blood are only present in blood. They rarely, if at all, go into your interstitial fluid. Okay, the only exception is probably white blood cells, but we don't need to get into that. All right, so within your blood, about 55% of your total volume makes up what's called the liquid portion of your blood, which is called plasma. Okay, this is all this yellow liquid that you're seeing gushing out, because if it's just cells, they can't move. Remember, this is a fluid portion of your circulatory system. So that's why there's got to be a fluid portion, which is the plasma. And inside the plasma, other than having your cells, it has a whole bunch of other, transport functions. For example, there's a lot of dissolved ions in there, which some of those ions are buffering blood, such as bicarbonate that we talked about before. Um, they can maintain osmotic balance with sodium ion, potassium ion, etc. And they can affect muscle and nerve activity, which rely heavily on sodium ions, potassium ion, and calcium ions. So this is why your plasma can store all those, get those ions circulating to, for those purposes. There's also plasma proteins that floating around in your plasma. They're not cells, they're just proteins floating around, and there's a bunch. Just name two as a few as an example. There's antibodies that's floating around in your plasma to fight pathogens as we know it. And then there's also fibrinogen. Fibrinogen is one of the proteins that will help with the clotting process. I'll explain that process in a bit and what fibrinogen do. And then lastly, they can transport nutrients, metabolic wastes, respiratory gases, and as well as hormones. So this fluid contains a lot of stuff, tinier things that are not than other than cells, that is for distribution around the body. So then, what are the cellular components? The cellular elements have three types of cells and make up about 45% of your total blood volume. Make sure you know the gist of these numbers because I might ask that as an exam question. Okay, so about 45% of your blood volume should be cellular components. And there are three types of cell. First of those are red blood cells. You got to know the fancy term called erythrocytes. Remember, I talked about this earlier in a previous chapter. Cytes always mean cells, and urethro is another good term to remember, anything to do with red color. Okay, so red color cells, that's really what erythrocytes means. And they are usually the most numerous of the three. Okay, I think it's somewhere in the 99% range of your blood cells are red blood cells or erythrocytes. And they are for the very important function of transporting oxygen. So which is why they have all these different features for your normal erythrocytes. First of all, they have this biconcave structure that you're seeing in that particular picture here. That's why they're always looking kind of like a scuba, like a tube, the tube you go for swimming. Yeah, it looks like that tube. But of course, the center is not hollow, but it has that biconcave. So when we're looking at it from the side, is kind of like that. That's why biconcave parts. So we're taking this red blood cell and turning it on its side to see this view. That's what we mean by biconcave. And having that extra curvature like that here and here is what gives red blood cell more surface area to maximize the amount of oxygen they can carry and drop off elsewhere. Um, Another interesting about erythrocytes is they don't have nuclei. They don't need a nuclei because they're constantly regenerated by your bone marrow. We'll talk about that process in a bit. But not having a nuclei only leaves more room for more hemoglobin to be packed in there. The bulk of the protein that's residing in your erythrocytes are hemoglobin, because hemoglobin is for the protein that has iron in it for binding oxygen. Okay, so if your red blood cells or erythrocyte don't have hemoglobin, it does nothing. It cannot transport any oxygen at all. What gives erythrocyte their capacity to transport oxygen are hemoglobin molecules. And then they also lack mitochondria and can only produce ATP via anaerobic respiration or anaerobic metabolism, such as glycolysis. Now, this makes sense because remember, the important job of erythrocytes is to carry oxygen. If they're doing aerobic respiration, using up all the oxygen, then it defeats the purpose of them carrying oxygen. It's kind of like you're the food delivery guy, but you end up stealing food from your delivery. That's really what it means. Okay, so erythrocytes, they have to deliver oxygen. They cannot use up that oxygen. That's very critical for tissues out there that can die without oxygen. So you have to deliver the food to starving people. You can't steal food away from them. So this is why then erythrocytes don't have the ability to do aerobic metabolism because of that. And that's why they don't need it. They don't need a mitochondria. All right, so if you have, let's say, abnormal hemoglobin structure, we talked about this again way in the beginning of the semester, you can end up with sickle cell disease, where the hemoglobin molecules, end up looking not the structure that is supposed to be, and it ends up clumping and aggregating within the red blood cells that turns the red blood cells into a sickle shape like this. Okay, that's why they call it sickle cell anemia or sickle cell disease. So this shape of red blood cell are able to squeeze through tiny capillaries. This one, not very much the case. They end up clumping and aggregating on top of each other, and so people with sickle cell disease, not only are they lack of oxygen due to a sickle cell shaped red erythrocyte, they also die faster because of their shape. On top of that, they are getting blood clots very often because of that. So sickle cell disease is not something anyone wants to have, but yet it is something you have to live with for the rest of your life and deal with indirect symptoms, or like have drugs, that medication that can help with the symptoms. Um, but it's all due to one nucleotide mutation for sickle cell disease. Okay, second and third type of cells, we're not going to dive deep into those. You have leukocytes, which are your white blood cells for, of course, fighting infections. Not only can they fight pathogens, they can also engulf any debris from dead cells, because they're pretty much like your trash, garbage truck going around your body looking for anything that you don't need anymore. They will eat it up and they will recycle that stuff. And then you have thrombocytes, which are platelets that function in blood clotting. All right. So blood regeneration is an important process because erythrocytes, leukocytes, and thrombocytes all have a limited lifetime. They have to be replenished throughout your life, and that's for an important purpose. The longer your cells live, the more chances it has to acquire mutations. So it's a very probably a natural selection adaptation that gives us that ability to regenerate blood cells constantly, because of the fact that these are so important cells that you don't want them to start mutating and doing all kinds of things. We're relying them for the circulatory system to keep you alive, in a sense. So that's why, instead of letting them live a long time and accumulating mutations in them, we rather them being made constantly. So there are specific stem cells that can produce all the blood cells, all the types of blood cells you have. And those stem cells are usually located in the red bone marrow. Now, what is stem cell? Stem cell is defined as those cells that can reproduce indefinitely. They can divide by mitosis. One of their daughter cell will remain as a stem cell to keep the stem cell population there. And then the other daughter cell will then become your specialized cells. That differentiation we're talking about. One stem cell can become a cardiac muscle cell. One stem cell can become a neurons in your brain and spinal cord, etc. So when the embryo is just forming, all these stem cells can divide to all those things. But one of the cool stem cells that can constantly still divide into new specialized cells are your blood stem cells. Okay, because we unfortunately we don't have just stem cells that would all of a sudden become a new neuron on its own to recover from neuron injuries. That's why people that have injuries with their brain or spinal cord, they lose that particular capability for the rest of their life, because those neurons won't come back. And then that is a side note. An active area of research is, how can we tell those stem cells or inject these patients with these problems with stem cells that can potentially and tell it to become specifically a neural stem cell, or a neural stem cell to become a neuron, or a cardiac muscle stem cells to become new cardiac muscle cells, because that will be cool. People that have heart attack, we can inject them with cardiac muscle cells to regenerate the heart. But that is not a possibility as of yet. But blood cells do have the special stem cells that constantly divide, specifically called hematopoietic stem cell, and they tend to be in the bone marrow of ribs, sternum, vertebrae bones, or pelvis. Okay, so when people have to do, let's say, bone marrow autopsies, or transplant bone marrow, they have to go in, that needle has to go into the bones, which is why they say it's very painful afterwards. Of course, while you're on it, they may give you pain medication, but it's very painful because the needle has to go into your bones in order to get those red bone marrow. All right. And then so within the bone marrow, there's these hematopoietic stem cells, blood stem cells, that would then can divide into lymphoid progenitors, which will then produce a specific type of white blood cells or leukocytes called lymphocytes, because there's actually multiple types of leukocytes in your immune system. But one specific type is made just by lymphoid progenitors. And then you have myeloid progenitors that can form your erythrocytes, thrombocytes, and then your other leukocytes that is not generated. So your stem cells has full capacity to form all the blood cell types you can have. Okay, and erythrocytes usually are replaced most often because they are the shortest lived. They live around 120 days. Now this is with the exception of leukocytes when they're fighting infections. Okay, so when leukocytes are fighting infections, they can live as short as 30 minutes because what leukocytes do is they go and engulf whatever pathogen they need to engulf, and then they will die off once they have eat up all the debris, eat up the bacteria, whatever it is, they will die off. So, but if they're not actively fighting an infection, they can last a lot longer than 120 days compared to erythrocytes. So that's the only exception there. And then when oxygen levels are low, kidneys will actually release a hormone called EPO, or known as erythropoietin, that will stimulate production of more erythrocytes because that's a homeostatic mechanism. Your kidney is seeing blood all the time as blood is being filtered. We'll discuss that in the next chapter in urinary system. So all your blood pass through the kidneys multiple times throughout the day. And so kidney sees the amount of blood all the time. And when it senses, hey, there's not enough red blood cells coming through, there's not enough erythrocytes coming through, it realizes that, and there's not enough blood pressure, let's say, coming through the kidney, they will then release this hormone, EPO. EPO then circulates around your body, goes towards your red bone marrow and tells it, hey, there's not enough blood going around the body here, especially the kidneys. So let's make more erythrocytes. Okay, so that's when they make more erythrocytes, increase the amount of red blood cells, increase blood pressure back to normal. All right, so that's one feature of kidney participating in blood volume or blood amounts homeostasis, or oxygen delivery homeostasis. Okay, and then the one, another part about, feature about thrombocytes that they're able to do is that our blood can clot. So that's a good purpose, because if we get an injury or a cut in our blood vessels, all these blood components can come out of our blood vessels, and now you have a leakage somewhere, and they can continue to leak until you patch it up. Just like how if a pipe bursts, it will continue bursting, okay, until you cover it up and patch it up. So that process in our body is called coagulation, where it stops the bleeding after an injury. Platelets or thrombocytes are recruited to the site of injury usually. They start sort of coagulating and aggregating on top of each other and sort of block that cut or injury site to stop blood flow through that particular hole. They will also release clotting factors that recruit more thrombocytes to the area. They also activate what's called the prothrombin to thrombin, kind of like pepsinogen to pepsin in the stomach. They will activate prothrombin to thrombin. Thrombin then converts fibrinogen to fibrin. And fibrin is then the protein that will aggregate to form threads that form the framework of the clot. Going back to my analogy of if you have a tear in your pants, you're going to grab some patch of cloth, put it in the tear, and you'll start sewing it up, right? So that patch of cloth you grab to close up that wound is like your thrombocytes, your platelets, closing up that open area. And then you have thread that patch it up and sort of sew it all together. That's just like your fibrin. Your fibrin's like, well, just that patch is not good enough because that patch can just float off into the bloodstream. So it kind of reinforces that framework of the clot by threading through the entire area, making sure it stays in place until that blood vessel is recovered, skin cells are recovered, and then the clot can go away, dissolve on its own. So any mutation that inhibits a clotting process is what we call then hemophilia, because that will usually end up with excessive clotting, and because of the fact that you can't clot. Okay. All right, so this is a quick video going through just to show you what that process takes. You don't have to know all the details of the names of the things that are involved. I show this, like I said, to my non-major students just for them to be in awe of all the steps required just to clot, because you think, oh, clotting just happens very quickly. But a lot of things are happening in your cells for that clotting process to happen.
In a first step towards clot formation, platelets are recruited to the site of vessel injury by now exposed molecules of the vessel wall, such as collagen and von Willebrand factor. This factor mediates the linking of platelets to collagen via a specific receptor in the platelet membrane.
It's cute the way they portray this.
The resulting change of shape of the platelet from its resting state
Like an
into the
alien.
dendritic form indicates activation. The activated platelet in turn releases prothrombotic molecules such as adenosine diphosphate, ADP. By binding to its receptors, ADP induces aggregation.
Boop, boop, boop. Isn't that cool?
And recruits further platelets to the site.
So there's all those clotting factors.
Thromboxane is another important mediator of platelet activation and aggregation. Under its influence, the platelets cross-link with each other. These interlocking mechanisms cause platelet activation to snowball. The clot grows rapidly. Activated platelets also trigger the coagulation cascade and thus the formation of thrombin.
There's thrombin.
In turn, stimulates platelet activation even further, a continuous feedback loop. Additionally, thrombin induces the formation of fibrin for the mesh stabilizing the
See
clot.
the yellow thread going in and out
The
of the
self-reinforcing process
this.
of platelet activation,
That's fibrin.
crucial in the formation of blood clots, is an obvious therapeutic target in conditions caused by inappropriately triggered blood coagulation.
Okay, so that video kind of ends with inappropriate triggering of coagulation, which leads to our very good topic of cardiovascular disease. Not that it's good, but is interesting topic in terms of what can go wrong with our cardiovascular system. I know we are at an hour, but let me finish this last part really quick, and then I'll go into part 3 for the respiratory system. Like I said, this chapter will be kind of long due to they're trying to cover 2 organ systems in one chapter, which is really overachieving. But I'm just going according to what the book says, okay? All right, and the objectives of the class says we have to do. All right, so that clotting process, you saw how complicated it was in the video. It takes multi-steps, multiple proteins to do multiple things in order to finish that whole clotting process. And that's for a good purpose, because if clotting was done too easily, then abnormal clotting can also happen randomly elsewhere. We want to minimize that as much as we can, which is why clotting is a very complicated process to ensure that it only happens when it needs to, such as an injury or a cut to your blood vessels. You cannot just have it happening when your blood is just flowing fine and all of a sudden it starts to clot together. You will form a blockage in your blood vessels. So that is related to cardiovascular diseases. More than 750,000 people in the US die each year from cardiovascular diseases. That is anything to do with the heart or the blood vessels, any abnormality with those parts of the circulatory system. So one of those common condition is called atherosclerosis. Atherosclerosis is when the artery starts to harden due to accumulation of fatty deposits in the blood vessel wall. So why does that happen? So usually we said that blood vessels are covered by an inner layer called the endothelial layer, endothelium. So that endothelium are meant to be smooth and continuous in the blood vessels. But if there is any damage to arterial lining or blood vessel lining for that matter, that can result in inflammation, because leukocytes are so good at their job. Whenever they see a damaged area, they rush right to it and try to repair it. So they see this tear in the endothelium layer of a blood vessel, for example, they rush to that area and then they induce inflammation, because inflammation, even though it sounds, painful for us humans, but it is for a good purpose for the body to recover, because inflammation causes your blood vessels to dilate, allow all those repair cells to come to the site very quickly. So inflammation is for a good purpose of repair. But in this case is, creating things like allowing the more leukocytes to come to that area. Leukocytes would actually then absorb lipids, for example, like your cholesterol, and then start depositing fat in the area. I guess that's how they think they can repair that area. They're like, oh, there's a tear. Let me ingest fat here and try to patch up this area. So they start depositing all this fat into the wall of the blood vessel, which is a bad story for the blood vessel. It will, if more and more fat start to accumulate, you will end up with a plaque. And that plaque can grow larger and larger and come, to the point where it sort of maybe covering half or 2/3 or even 80% of your artery flow, which is a bad story. That plaque deposit also causes your artery wall to become thick and the main thing here, stiff. Remember, one of the main traits of arteries is that they got to be elastic. When they're stiff like that, they cannot let blood flow through it as efficiently as an elastic artery can, okay? Because artery needs to do that elastic recoil to further let the blood progress. When it's stiff, it cannot do that properly, okay? So which means then blood flow is somehow blocked or slowed in this scenario. That's when you have arteriosclerosis, okay? Other than damage to arterial lining and then causing inflammation. I mean, you're like, what can cause damage to arterial lining? There's many factors. One of those is hypertension. Okay, hypertension is when you have high blood pressure. And we're not talking about acute hypertension, but chronic hypertension, because your blood vessels are very strong. Okay, that little endothelial layer, smooth muscle layer are doing their best to keep your blood vessels nice and intact and elastic. But if you're bombarding that blood vessel with a very high pressure, higher than it should, instead of 120 millicurie, let's say you're bombarding it with 140 millicurie. Okay, that's a lot of 20 units of higher pressure. Doesn't seem a lot, but if you're thinking about years of that, years of bombarding your blood vessel with higher pressure, that can weaken your arterial lining, leading to possibly damage in the walls. When you weaken it, it can lead to damage. Damage leads to inflammation. Inflammation leads to plaque, etc. So it's like a whole pathway of cascade of things that can happen. Now, if a plaque ruptures, that's also another case scenario where it gets dangerous. A thrombus or an abnormal blood clots can form within the artery, and if it stays in there, it might be, just blockage, but which is bad too. But then what's worse is if it dislodges from the area, let's say from your arm or your leg or something, your thigh artery, it can then travel around your whole entire circulatory system. Now, the good thing that can happen is maybe that blood clot, as it's circulating around your body, will disintegrate and they won't be a big blood clot anymore or get smaller as it goes around. But if it doesn't and stay as a big piece of blood clots, once it gets to the tiny, tiny arteries within your heart, within your brain, that can completely block blood flow within the heart or the brain, and that can trigger heart attack or the stroke, depending where it gets lodged in. If it's lodged in heart blood vessels, it will be a heart attack. If it goes to the brain, then it's a stroke. So heart attack, known as myocardial infarction, happens when blockage occurs in one or more coronary arteries, because coronary arteries is what supply blood to the cardiac muscles. Like I said, cardiac muscles are pumping all the time, contracting all the time, requiring ATP energy all the time. So if they are cut off from oxygen, they will start dying very quickly. And the more heart muscles are affected, the more likely the heart will stop beating completely, which is what we call cardiac arrest. Note that heart attack is not equivalent to cardiac arrest. Heart attack can be minor, okay, and where the patient can live through the situation, if it's just a small portion of the heart that's affected. But heart attack can also lead to cardiac arrest if, let's say, a completely large portion, okay, of the heart is affected. The heart just maybe 2/3 of the heart stops pumping and they're completely dead. Then that's a cardiac arrest. They will stop pumping altogether. So partial blockage of coronary arteries are usually signs or symptoms that can tell you, hey, a real heart attack might be coming. This includes, constant chest pain, called angina pectoris, which then it's usually more painful when you're exerting energy or exerting stress on the heart. So if you are climbing up the stairs and you're running out of breath, one thing. Second thing is your chest starts hurting, and it happens every time you go up the stairs. That's angina pectoris, possibly. Okay, so you've definitely got to get that checked out if that's the case, or if your family relative have that problem. All right, so an obstructed artery can be treated, of course, surgically by inserting a stent, or if stent is not a likelihood, they can do a bypass surgery. So a stent is where they use they call it balloon angioplasty. So they insert a balloon, and the balloon has that little metal stents or plastic stent. I don't know what material they make it, but it's a little mesh thing. And when the balloon enlarges, the mesh also enlarges. And when they remove the balloon, what stays in the blood vessel or artery is then the mesh. And the mesh is what keeps the artery nice and open and kind of push those plaque and fat deposit flat against the blood vessel wall. So that way you flatten all that lipids up, and then it opens up this whole area back up. That's how you can recover blood flow. Or a bypass is when you take another artery from elsewhere, and then a blood vessel from elsewhere, and then sort of, let's say if this was the blockage, you put a new blood vessel around it, so then blood can't flow through there, but they can go around it. That's why it's called a bypass. Okay, and then if, like I said, the blood clot or blockage is around, or the plaque is going to forming in the brain, or blood clot is going to the brain, then you have a stroke, which, depending on how much of your brain is affected, or how much of your brain don't have oxygen, the severity of the consequence can vary. The more neurons or more parts of your brain are affected, the more likely you will not come back to life. Usually stroke patients can come back with specific capability lost, because depending what part of the brain was affected, let's say if the stroke was around what's called the occipital lobe, then the patient can be blind when they wake up. Whether they recover that, we don't know. It's all up to Mother Nature kind of deal, because you cannot repair neurons or brain parts. Okay, so it all depends what part of the brain is affected. That will be the consequence for the patient. Okay, so I'll stop here for part 2. We don't have too much more to go. I kind of glossed over respiratory system as the last part of the chapter. So maybe I would think another 40 to 45 minutes in part 3 for respiratory.